morning. In the tomb of the soul, we take refuge from the world and its heaviness. In the tomb of the soul, we wrap ourselves in the security of darkness. Sometimes this is a comfort. Sometimes it's an escape. Sometimes it prepares us for experience. Sometimes it insulates us from life. In today's service, we celebrate change. But as we look deeper into the three traditions we celebrate today, we see a deeper theme that emerges, that breaks through even, we might say, a theme of deliverance. We start with the oldest of the traditions, as far as we know, from the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible. The editors of the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version of the New Oxford Bible, tell us that although Egyptian records make no reference to the border incident of the flight of slaves into the wilderness of Sinai, there can be little doubt that the story rests upon actual historical occurrences. Various lines of evidence point to the period of the 19th dynasty, about 1350 to 1220 BCE, as the most probable historical setting. The story unfolds against the background of Egyptian imperialism that motivated ambitious pharaohs to use Hebrew slaves as pawns in their scheme of world politics. You may remember the story. You may even have heard it as a child in Sunday school classes. And we won't try to retell the whole story of Exodus today, but let's remember this much. At the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph brings his family to Egypt. Over the following centuries, the descendants of Joseph's family, the Hebrews, become so numerous that when a new king comes to power, he fears what might happen if the Hebrews decide to rise up against the Egyptians. The best way to avoid this is to enslave them. But they continue to have many children. In his fear, or maybe paranoia, the Pharaoh sends soldiers to kill all newborn sons of the Hebrew mothers. But one baby is saved by the subterfuge of his mother and sister, who place him in a basket and send him downstream, where he is rescued by no other than the daughter of the Pharaoh. So despite all efforts to suppress the Hebrews, Moses is saved and raised, ironically, to be a prince of Egypt. Yes, a Hebrew child as prince of Egypt. You remember that as an adult, Moses kills an Egyptian guard when he sees him beating a Hebrew slave. Moses then flees for his life, heading into the desert where he meets a Midian priest named Jethro. In the course of time, he marries the daughter of Jethro, and they have children. One day, while watching over the sheep, Moses has a dramatic experience. He encounters God in the wilderness in the shape of a burning bush. God calls out to him, and Moses answers, "Here I am." Then God tells Moses that he has been chosen to free the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt. Moses is not so sure about this. God tells him he'll have the help of his brother Aaron. So Moses returns to Egypt and demands that Pharaoh release the Hebrews from bondage. But Pharaoh refuses. And as a result, God sends 10 plagues upon Egypt. Now, this is a horrifying story if told with all the dramatic emphasis that we can imagine it was told around campfires in a desert wilderness for dozens of generations. Here's the way Ariella Pelea tells it. The first plague is a plague of blood. The waters of Egypt are turned to blood. All the fishes die, and the water is unusable. The second plague is a plague of frogs, as hordes of them swarm through the land of Egypt. The third plague is a plague of gnats. Masses of these tiny insects invade Egyptian homes and plague the Egyptian people. The fourth plague is a plague of wild animals which invade Egyptian homes and lands, causing destruction and havoc. The fifth plague is a plague of pestilence, as Egyptian livestock is struck down with disease. The sixth plague is a plague of boils, as the Egyptian people are plagued with painful boils that cover their bodies. The seventh plague is a plague of hail, as hailstones beat down upon the Egyptian crops and destroy them. The eighth plague is a plague of locusts that swarm down upon Egypt and eat all the remaining crops and food until there's not much left. The ninth plague is a plague of darkness. This darkness covers the land of Egypt for 3 days. And the 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. The firstborn of every Egyptian family is killed. Even the firstborn of animals die. The 10th plague is where the Jewish holiday of Passover gets its name, because when the angel of death visited Egypt, it passed over the Hebrew homes, which had been marked with lamb's blood on the doorposts. It's only after the 10th plague that the Pharaoh relents and releases the Hebrews. But they must make a quick getaway lest he change his mind. So they quickly bake their bread, not even waiting for it to rise. And down to this day, to commemorate their being saved, the Jews eat unleavened bread called matzah during the Passover time. Now, you would think that the Pharaoh would have been beaten down into permanent submission after the toll taken by all these plagues, wouldn't you? But you'd be wrong. Soon enough, after the former slaves leave the land, the Pharaoh changes his mind and sends his soldiers after them. The Hebrews get to the Sea of Reeds, which miraculously parts for them to allow them to get through to the other side. And when the soldiers try to follow them, the waters crash down upon them, and the Hebrew people are saved. According to Ariella Pelea, who supplied the basis of this summary, Jewish legend says that when the angels began rejoicing as the Hebrews escaped and the soldiers drowned, God reprimanded them, saying, "My creatures are drowning, and you're singing songs." The Midrash teaches that even under conditions of dramatic rescue from such unrelenting persecution, we are not to rejoice in the death of others. And so, finally, the Hebrew people have escaped the days of slavery and are safe to make their way to the promised land. How are we to understand this dramatic story, we people of the 21st century, who undoubtedly would find other things than the hand of God to account for such amazing series of astounding events? We can dismiss it out of hand as dramatic fiction, like, say, the tales of the Arabian Nights, stories told to serve a purpose, to provide a justification for enduring suffering. We could look for a scientific explanation for such an amazing series of events. In fact, one was offered on Easter Sunday, 2010, by the National Geographic in their special presentation, The 10 Plagues of the Bible, explaining how archaeological evidence reveals that there was a dramatic climate change around this time, which would account for a rapid warming of the Red Sea, the proliferation of red algae that would choke the river and turn it red like blood, that would slow down the maturation of the amphibians, allowing for a widespread infestation of insects. And then the frogs would then grow more quickly than usual and swarm across the land. Yes, there's a scientific explanation that's been offered, and you might find it convincing. It's the National Geographic, after all. But here's an interesting point of view offered by a biblical scholar, Rabbi Brad Hirschfield. Egypt is not Egypt in the Bible. In the original Hebrew, it's called Mitzrayim, which means tight places or in narrow straits. To be in Mitzrayim, Egypt, is not simply to be a slave and a story from long ago. It is the paradigmatic experience of being stuck between a rock and a hard place, an experience which virtually all people have had at some time in their lives. Passover reminds us all people can get jammed up and likely will. It can happen to all of us. and there's always the possibility of redemption and release. Whoever you are, says Rabbi Hirschfield, and whatever faith you follow, Passover invites us to take stock of where we are stuck and see the help we need to get unstuck. The holy day of Easter, you don't need me to tell you, is a high point of the Christian calendar. In the liberal Christian theological school I attended, we were introduced to the terms high and low Christology. To hold a high Christology was to believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus after death, and to believe that Jesus is in fact of the same substance as God the Creator. I may be going out on a limb here, but I think most of us here have a relatively low Christology. We are quite willing to see a certain genius in the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. I see him as the supreme mystic of the Christian tradition. I'm quite willing to believe he was an exceptional healer, though whether that healing extends to the supernatural, I find highly doubtful. Certainly, he was an inspiration. Certainly, he was a person of courage and forthrightness and had exceptionally high moral values. And I am willing to believe that he was willing to give his life for the sake of his friends. But the physical resurrection of Christ in the body, as well as the spirit. We talked a little bit about this at the Christmas Eve service 3 months ago. The Gospel of Mark was the earliest of the Gospels, and in its original state, it included no post-resurrection appearances by Jesus. The Gospel of Mark is preserved in 16 chapters. The final chapter originally consisted of 8 verses, and here they are. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early, on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. And they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. In the tomb of the soul, we take refuge from the world and its heaviness. In the tomb of the soul, we wrap ourselves in the security of darkness. Sometimes this is a comfort. Sometimes it is an escape. Sometimes it prepares us for experience. Sometimes it insulates us from life. Whatever else it is meant to do, the Easter story wants to offer us hope that there is no end to living, that death does not have the last word. If death is to be understood as eternal darkness, oblivion, perdition, meaninglessness, why then we must be saved from that, mustn't we? And we have to work out for ourselves the ways of meaning in a world of mortality. The Gospel of John 15:13. Greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. The message of Jesus was a message of love and ultimately of sacrifice. His teaching was seen as dangerous to the state. What does it mean to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's, when in the view of the state, all of it belongs to Caesar? A revolutionary, an enemy of the state, a man or a god or a man-god. I'll leave that up to you to decide. What does it mean to be entombed? What does it mean to break free from entombment? The Gospel of John 12:24. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. There's a short saying that may explain much about the mission of Jesus. The Christian story is a story that originated in the Northern Hemisphere, which is why the Easter story conveniently dovetails into the natural cycle of the seasons, winter to spring. Easter is celebrated in the Southern Hemisphere as well, but it's a trickier challenge there to make a natural reconciliation with the movement of autumn into winter. When Christianity made its way to England, it confronted pagan traditions long established. The English historian, whom we call the Venerable Bede, lived in the late 7th and early 8th centuries and was an English monk at the Northumbrian monastery of St. Peter at Monk-Wearmouth, which today is part of Sunderland, England. His most famous work is translated from the Latin as the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. In Bede's book, Temporum Ratione, he tells us that April is known as Estramonth and is named for a goddess that the Anglo-Saxons honored in the spring. He says Estramonth has a name which is now translated as Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Estra, in whose honor a feast was celebrated in that month. And there's not much more we know about Estra. The folklorist Jacob Grimm says that he found evidence of Estra's existence in the oral traditions of certain parts of Germany as late as the 1800s, but there's no written evidence. Even though we are not certain about the existence of a god named Estra, the pagan festival of the coming of the spring, Ostara, is named after her. Ostara comes at a time when the dominance of the dark breaks into the time of the ever-increasing daylight, the first day of spring, in other words, which was laid in the day on March 19th this year. But we are early enough into the cycle to still celebrate the breakthrough of light from darkness, 12 hours and 42 minutes of daylight today. The Gospel of Mark 4:24. For the earth brings forth fruit of herself, first the blade, then the ear, and after that the full corn in the ear. And perhaps that is the best understanding that we, Unitarian, Universalist, Christian, pagan, Jews, can have of the endlessness of life. From the dark tomb of the seed case springs forth the blade of grass that holds the ear, that holds the full corn, that holds the secret of the seed that will drop once more into the darkness of the earth to die until it springs forth again in another season, and another season, and another season. In the tomb of the soul, we take refuge from the world and its heaviness. In the tomb of the soul, we wrap ourselves in the security of darkness. Sometimes this is a comfort. Sometimes it's an escape. Sometimes it prepares us for existence. Sometimes it insulates us from life. Be well. Be safe. Be saved. Happy Easter, Ostara, Passover, all.